Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Colleen Graffey, as you heard, law professor with Pepperdine University, and we have an all-star panel this afternoon, starting with, I believe he's known as the wise man of Washington. That would be Daniel Freed, who served 40 years as in the career foreign service, amongst many things, senior director at the National Security Council, ambassador to Poland, Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, and I hear that you worked with a dream team as Deputy Assistant Secretaries with you, and also, of course, now with the Atlantic Council. We also have Daria Kaleniuk, Executive Director of the Anti-Corruption Action Center, a very powerful organization shaping anti-corruption legislation in Ukraine, and I believe Daria might be doing a side business in T-shirts. If we can get a close-up on that T-shirt, make Russia small again. She's taking orders. Excellent. We also have Richard Kols, Latvian politician, former chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and now, congratulations, 2024 elected as a member of the European Parliament. To his right, we have Marko Mihkelson, former journalist, former editor-in-chief of the biggest national daily newspaper in Estonia, member of the Estonian Parliament, and chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And also with the journalistic background, we have Brian Whitmore. The journalism background includes many years with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, also on the academic side as a professor in practice. The very powerful podcast, if you haven't heard it, the Power Vertical podcast, and Brian is with the Atlantic Council as well. To start us off, of course, as a law professor, I have to point out that one of the most significant document in our international world order is the United Nations Charter. And the key article in the UN Charter is Article 2.4, which says that all members of the United Nations shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. And here we have Russia, the crime of crimes, the crime from which all others flow, the crime of aggression has been committed. How are we holding Russia accountable? What are we doing to hold Russia accountable? We will start with Dan Freed for his overview. Thanks, Dan. Oh, your mic's on.
Oh, okay. Hold Russia accountable, one, by helping Ukraine win, prevail, as the Biden administration now says, but also hit the Russian economy and mean it. There was a discussion, the discussion in the last panel set it up. So there are additional steps we can take on sanctions. Okay, I'm going to go through some of them to be real specific and concrete. One, God damn it, get the deal done on using the accumulated interest on Russian frozen assets. The G7 agreed to do it in July. That's a big deal. Now, weeks after, they don't have a decision that verges on dithering. The G7 leaders agreed to it. Do it. There may be some lawyers, I'm sure there are some lawyers and some financial people who are uncomfortable. I really don't care. Okay? They agreed to it. So get it done. Number two, the Russian oil price cap has had an impact. It has deprived the Russian economy of resources. But there is much more that can be done. On this, I'm going to demur. There are things specifically that I have in mind and that the Biden administration is considering, but they need to be creative and take the next step. I understand that in an election year, the people are worried about a spike in crude oil prices, but there are ways to get around this. And part B of energy, try to kill the Russian LNG industry, which some of the people at the State Department are enthusiastically going after. 3, on financial sanctions, flip the script, by which I mean don't debate which banks we should add, hit all Russian banks, put every single one under financial restrictions, and then have a license list for permitted transfers. Food, medicine, specific goods. Flip the script. A presumption of prohibition and sanction against every Russian bank. That sounds extreme, but if you actually think about it, we've gone after most of the Russian banks. It's time to go after all of them 100%. 3, the last panel discussed the third country transfer of a lot of Russian products. Like, why are all these cars going to Georgia or Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan when they're making their way through to Russia? You know, that's nice, but actually, you know, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan is not actually the problem. What was it, Ian Bond said that manufacturers are showing a curious lack of curiosity about where their stuff goes? Yeah, no kidding. Work upstream, go to manufacturers. Banks in the West have developed over the last almost 25 years, a culture of sanctions compliance. They put on a lot of people, they devote a lot of resources. A lot of manufacturers pretend they don't know where it's going. Oh my goodness, my turbines ended up in Crimea. Who could have known? I'm shocked. In such situations, in my old sanctions office at State, the term we used inside was put some heads on a pike, which means locate a Western manufacturer who is acting in bad faith, who knows or should have known or could have known with elementary due diligence where their stuff was going. And don't pick any old product. Pick something like fancy machine tools or chips and go after them. Go upstream, okay? Final, and this is something that Anne Applebaum has recently written about, and she's right, as she usually is. Let us all clean up our act, okay? Financial transparency. The British are guilty of this. Yeah, how about Delaware corporations? You know, it is financial opacity. No one should have the right to own millions, billions of dollars worth of property in the name of some fictitious shell corporation. Transparency is clear, and there's nobody clean. The advantage of nobody being clean is that the Americans can't point fingers at anybody. We all have to take this step together, okay? And mean it. So I've tried to be policy specific in answer to your question.
Thank you, Dan. Excellent. And sort of a follow-on question is, many view that the sanctions come into place and then the oligarch has shifted money to an ex-wife or someplace else and view these sanctions as something that's static and it's playing whack-a-mole. How often are you able to, is the U.S. government able to update these sanctions? How quickly does it move? And how do you get the information on who to sanction in case people have any tips after the conference?
Yeah, I mean, there's an actual answer to that question. First of all, the Biden administration has done a pretty good job in what I call sanctions maintenance, that is, hitting evaders, plugging loopholes, going after companies. But to see what I mean, take a look at the last sanctions list that the State Department put out. I think it was last week, maybe the week before. I mean, it's a long list, but go on the OFAC website or the State Department website, because they now issue these things in parallel, and there's some overlap but not complete. That's good stuff. But what I'm talking about is actual escalation. Change the game. You got to do both, but you can do it. And you're going to have to engage in what are called secondary sanctions, and that's a fancy term. What it means is we're going after Russia in our Russia sanctions program, but if there is, to pick a country completely at random with no significance, if an Austrian bank is playing footsie with sanctioned Russian banks, you go after that bank, okay? And that's called secondary sanctions. And you have to pick your targets judiciously, but go after them. Our risk tolerance should be commensurate with the violation, and it's a big, real war in Ukraine. So there's all policymakers, you know this, look for all gain, no pain, risk-free options, and hint, they don't actually exist.
Thank you so much. Daria, what is your take on how we hold Putin and Russia accountable?
Let's start with the question that it's Russia, not just Putin. Because there are hundreds, thousands of little Putins which are making missiles, which are being fired at Ukrainian orphanages, schools, hospitals, critical infrastructure. There are hundreds, thousands of little Putins which are at our land, trying to destroy our right of existence. So it's not Putin. We have to hold Russia accountable. Also, we have to recognize in our mind that all that started not on February 24, 2022, and not even in 2014. In Ukraine, we clearly remember August 8, 2008 in Georgia, where Russia violated the charter. And no one reacted properly. It was like, okay, it's normal. No sanctions, business as usual, let's deal with Russia. Let's build more joint pipelines because Russian cheap gas is important for the prosperity of Europe. And that encouraged Russia, that impunity and lack of accountability encouraged Russia because everybody thought that, okay, Russia is too big to be punished, so let's make Russia small again. We have to make Russia small again, first of all, in our minds. And what Ukrainians are doing now in Kursk is actually changing the perspective in our minds, that Russia can be small, Russia can be defeated, Russia can be occupied for the defensive purposes in Ukraine. Then coming to the very practical steps, how to hold Russia accountable now, in the midterm and the long term. So now, 50 billion decision is good, but honestly it takes so long, and I can't until now understand why we can't seize now immediately all 300 billion of Russian sovereign assets, most of which are being stored in France and Belgium. So all this, I'm a lawyer myself, but I don't understand neither legal argument nor financial argument. It's just, you know, when European Union is saying that they can't take this decision, I'm thinking, okay, is it the union of scared? Or it's the union of people who believe in democracy and ready to fight for that? And when there are discussions in Germany or in the United States about, you know, the burden on taxpayers in the EU or in America, so much aid has to be sent to Ukraine, so many billions, and we are saying, okay, we are fine with it. We understand it's a burden on the taxpayers, but there is Russian money. Just take it. Send it to Ukraine. Let's set up foundation. It can be only even in Brussels. And make out of 300 billion a trillion. And so then Ukraine will have money to build drones to make Russia accountable.
So, Daria, just to be specific, hasn't the agreement been that we can freeze the assets, but seizing the assets is complicated and problematic, but taking the interest would be more amenable to most countries? And wasn't there an agreement that we can go with the interest rather than actually seizing the asset itself?
It is running away from responsibility and of taking the risk. Of course it is risky, but what's the alternative? Making Ukraine fail? From the legal point of view, and most of international lawyers are saying it is doable. From legal construction allows that to happen. Financial argument, okay, G7 countries, they cover 97% of all the international transactions in foreign currency. So if all G7 together decide to seize that, nothing will be harmed. So I can't understand why European Union is so exposed to the pressure from Saudis, who are saying, okay, if you seize that, we're going to take all our investments from Europe. I think, yeah, you take this risk, but what's the alternative? Making Ukraine just fail? And what will then it cost? So I think it's a time of taking some leadership and proactive leadership and taking some risks for the European Union and for countries in Europe. In America, the Repo Act was adopted. Nothing prevents the United States now from actually seizing these 5 billion assets which are there. And this is the concept which we are having. Make Russia pay for this war and make Russia pay for Russia being defeated by Ukrainians. And we can produce more weapons. We don't have money in Ukraine to produce more weapons, long-range drones and missiles, etc. If we have this money from Russia, we can do that. And it's not only this 300 billion which we can seize, but there are other options how to force Russia pay. All these companies which still are dealing with Russia and which are headquartered and have their legal entities across Europe and America, they have to pay additional tariff. The tax of war and the tax for war profiteering. And these also have to go to the fund which has to support Ukraine, support protection of the critical infrastructure in Ukraine, and support of building weapons in Ukraine, for Ukraine. As for the sanctions, on Monday last year, there were 236 air targets, particularly targeting critical infrastructure of Ukraine, all over 4 nuclear power plants. And if it is a secret for you, we were close to the nuclear collapse. And there has to be proper reaction of the international community saying, the attack on the transformers, these huge transformers, 750 kilowatts transformers, which are transforming electricity from the nuclear power plant, has to be equal to using the nuclear weapons. And that the consequences will be as there was used nuclear weapons, but there is no statement like that. One more attack like that, and there could be real nuclear explosion. But Rosatom was also not sanctioned. So there is so much we still can do, and Europe still can do, to help us in Ukraine to hold Russia accountable with the power of force. As a lawyer, I don't believe in the power of conventions anymore or agreements. I believe in the power of weapons and the power of strong army, which can say Russia that it's actually small.
But so we better go directly to the European Union. I know you're just coming in, but
I'm a freshman.
as a freshman. But what's the view from the EU? What should we be doing to hold Putin and Russia accountable?
Well, even right now I represent the European Parliament. I'm still, in my heart and in my mind, a true Latvian. And you know how the Russian diplomats are calling the Latvian politicians, or the ones who are going after Russia internationally, extremely primitive hooligans. This is, that we've been coined, and why is that? Is actually, we do try to bring around international institutions by that they adhere to the principles they were founded on, like, for example, the OECD. Thank God we did manage to, well, not to expel, but at least Russia itself suspended its participation as well. And there's numerous organizations still to be on the list where Russia should be expelled. The WTO is one of those as well. I mean, it took 25 years for Russia to join the WTO, but the first day on, when they joined, they started to obstruct all the international trade agreements, principles, and etc. So from accountability, I would say one thing in the West we need to start, it's both in Europe, but across the ocean as well. There are more and more increasing voices, maybe not loud, but there are in the rooms whispering, well, we need to find a way to sit at a table and maybe start to talk about first ceasefire, then maybe negotiations. Those who deny that there are such conversations are naive. There are, and they're actually increasing. The immorality of that is that if we're truthful to ourselves, when we say impunity cannot prevail, will not prevail, and we are supporting the International Criminal Court and its arrest warrant on Putin and other war criminals as well, but then we hint that we are ready actually to negotiate with the war criminal, that we ask for the International Criminal Court to trial. So this is absurdity that is happening, and I think it was yesterday, Peskov made an interview, and he was asked, okay, how does it look that, you know, the West is supporting Ukraine now, is entering Russia and so on? And he said, well, it might be entertaining in Europe, but the rest of the world is looking at things differently. And he might be right, because let's go back in 2023, February, 23rd of February, the vote at the UN. 141 countries voted condemning the act of aggression by Russia. So since then, there's no resolution being put on the floor for a vote in regards to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And there's, the systematic war crimes committed, amounting almost 70,000 cases, and nothing is actually progressing. But in the meantime, we see the only European West countries are pushing for the International Criminal Court. There is an arrest warrant now on Shoigu, on Gerasimov, on Putin on different charges. But still, tomorrow is going to be a crucial day for ICC and its jurisdiction. Putin is about to visit Mongolia. Mongolia is a part of Roman statutes. If they don't arrest Putin, well, I think all eyes are now on Mongolia. It should be, and must be, but we also should, and we must send signals to Mongolia that if that is going to happen, there will be consequences. Mongolia is actually a partner country for NATO for years. Mongolia is deeply vested actually in cooperation with the European Union, with the NATO, and that might be undermined if tomorrow really Putin steps in Ulaanbaatar. Yes, there are people who are saying, well, in the past there's been cases where, the ICC warrant hasn't been appealed to. But then again, ICC is somewhat a new framework, but it has the universal jurisdiction. And if we talk of rules-based international order that we want to not only keep but to maintain, this is, for the accountability and impunity, a very crucial moment. Otherwise, our efforts would be really pointless, and we'll become actually a laughable stock, and somebody said the global south. I mean, we might think, and this is something where we catch ourselves in the West, that we think that the rest of the world thinks like us. No, we're actually in minority. Democracies are in minority. Democracies are actually shrinking. For the past 10 years, autocratic, semi-autocratic, autocratic wannabe countries are on the rise. So coming back on accountability, I don't want to interfere in Daniel's sphere of competences, because but one thing what I can mention, those who are saying that sanctions are not working, they do work. Just alone IMF 2022 data showed that because of the sanctions, Russia's GDP dropped by 10%. It's a huge, yes, it's not enough, but it's a huge drop. And I don't know the data for 23, and not alone for 24. So sanctions do work, maybe slowly, but they do work. And the last point I wanted to make, so right now, EU finally harmonized the legislation when it comes to those who are obstructing sanctions, bypassing, now it's a criminal offense. Before that, in some member states, it was administrative fine and so on. Now it's a criminal offense. So now we have to go further. We have to go after the enablers. Daniel mentioned manufacturers, the companies, but we should go after those who consult, those who want to violate the sanctions. Lawyers companies, lobbyist companies, and they're in their hundreds, and they are profiting from all of this. So this is another step. I know Marco mentioned I talk a lot. So I guess I'll stop here.
I think that's an excellent point about Mongolia and putting pressure on Mongolia now in hopes that we see Putin on the Zoom screen instead of going there in person. I also note it was a fantastic moment when the UN General Assembly voted to condemn, but let's remember there were also, wasn't it 34 nations that abstained? 34 nations, how could they not see this as an aggression, and how did they not have the wherewithal to condemn Russia about that? It's very troubling. Marco, what's the view from the Foreign Affairs Committee and Estonia?
Yeah, thank you, Colleen. Great to be back in Tbilisi, such a pivotal moment. I get a little bit sick and tired that, participating talks about how to make Russia accountable. It's obvious, it should be even not on consideration what we should do. My question is, and the worry is that we have not been critical enough towards our own governments, towards our own action, actually, not only during last 2.5 years, but during more than 20 or 30 years. I think that we have to realize and look into the mirror and say frankly that we have so far failed massively. And this actually has emboldened Russians to do what they do today. Dario said correctly that this is, and Tobias previously also mentioned about that this war is not about Ukraine. This war is not about to change geostrategic or geopolitical reality in Eastern Europe. This is about to change world order. Putin has constantly talking about that. Last time I heard he said that during Valdai meeting in last October. And they are not alone in this adventure. They have allies, and they're building a strong alliance in terms to achieve that goal, meaning, Iran, North Korea, and China. Obviously, they are all in one and another way interested to keep Russia going on with this, what they do right now in Ukraine. And believe me, every time I meet soldiers, defenders of our freedom in Ukraine, last time I was in Kharkiv region just 5 days ago, it is rather difficult to tell them that what we do in Europe or in the West, helping them, because they see on the ground that the promises what we keep or giving to Ukraine or to defenders of Ukraine are not fulfilled. And how come you can fight if those elementary promises are not fulfilled? Additional to that we are not able to make sure that Russia truly believes that they can be taken to the courts and being accountable. So first, what we should do is to realize that we collectively don't understand what should be our strategy yet. Yes, in Estonia, small country, we understand what is at stake. We have spent 1.8% of GDP during last 2.5 years helping Ukraine militarily, financially, every other way. And we can do more. And we call up our allies to spend at least 0.25% of GDP of respective countries every year for military help to Ukraine. Just imagine if Germany, the United States, France, or other countries, the UK, could spend at least 1% of GDP for Ukraine's help, we could have already today a totally different picture on the ground. So we have to really realize that if we want to defend our world order, this is what was also discussed previously in Kurz panel, then we have to win this war. If for that to win this war, we have to go in. We have to go in. We have to form coalition of willing if that is necessary. But first and foremost, as Tarja said, and Ukraine has actually many times confirmed that they can win with our help this war if we really supply them everything they need, and also we don't have or will have any limitations for them to use weaponry they have or they need. So, and last but not least, perhaps, to make Russia accountable is not only possible when Western countries do that or wish that. We have to have a much wider support on global level. I don't like the terms global south, but countries in Asia, in Africa, in Middle East, and in America, they watch who will win in this war, and they will take side after that. So the first and foremost, most important is, if we want to see Putin one day in The Hague, if we want to see Russia small again, if we want to see us being strong enough to define future's world order, we have to win in Ukraine.
Thank you. Yeah, excellent. And as you say, Estonia understands what's at stake, and perhaps that's part of the problem. Other countries don't have that same concept. Taking us over to Brian.
Sure. Thank you, Colleen. First of all, I want to nod here to Richards. I think we should all embrace this extremely primitive hooligans label. Maybe Daria can get us some T-shirts made up. And along those lines, I want to say I agree with everything my fellow panelists have said. But I want to, in the interest of being an extremely primitive hooligan, I want to broaden the aperture a little bit here and talk about what we mean by accountability. The question of accountability, for it to be true accountability, needs to be broader than legal accountability through criminal prosecutions. It needs to be broader than economic accountability through sanctions and through reparations. These are necessary, but they're not sufficient. And I want to think about the day after victory, and how we drive home the fact that Russia has to be accountable. True accountability needs to be much broader, and it needs to be much deeper. It needs to go beyond Putin. And to Russia's current leadership, along the lines of Daria's comment earlier, that this is Russia's war, not just Putin's war. But it's broader than that. We need to hold the mindset, the culture, the theory of history that made all of this possible accountable. True accountability requires historical and cultural accountability. It requires an accounting and an indictment of the imperial and the colonial culture, and the imperial and colonial historiography that has led Russia to view its neighbors, whether they are Ukrainians, Georgians, Belarusians, Moldovans, Balts, Central Asians, as inferior. And a true reading of Russian culture can only lead us to this conclusion, that Russian culture itself is imperial. So true accountability involves not just holding Vladimir Putin accountable, it involves holding Alexander Pushkin accountable. This is the intellectual ecosystem that made the horrors of Bucha possible. It's the intellectual ecosystem that made the ethnic cleansing in the Balts in the 40s that we are still feeling knock-on effects today possible. It's the intellectual ecosystem that made the invasion of Georgia and the continued state capture of Georgia possible. It's the intellectual ecosystem that's made the subjugation of Belarus possible. And this, we will only get beyond this. We will only hold Russia accountable when we re-examine Russian history and Russian culture in its entirety. Now, much of this can only be accomplished by Russians. And I'll have more to say on that in a later intervention. But I do want to say there are things that we can do in the West. Those of us that teach Russian politics and Russian history, and those of us that teach Russian literature. We can change the way we teach this. Because for more than a century, and I'll speak from what my academic area, the imperial version of Russian history that is taught in most American and most Western European universities is wrong. It was brought to the West by white Russian historians after the 1917 revolution and became part of our curriculums. I learned this in university. I had to unlearn it later because I was lucky enough to make friends with a Ukrainian historian that taught me that everything I learned in university was wrong, and I had to go back to school figuratively. Well, now I'm teaching in a university, and I'm trying to bring in a new curriculum that looks at the histories of these countries as independent of Russia. Georgia has its own history, independent of Russia. Ukraine certainly has its own history, independent of Russia, and we kind of need to bring this into our curriculum, because by uncritically accepting this imperial and colonial version of history that we've all been taught for generations, we have all become unwittingly Putin's little helpers. And I'll stop there.
And to come around this, this is, as you say, this is going to require the Russians taking ownership.
Yes.
Just quickly, how do you see, we're going to come to the audience questions in a moment, so if you have questions, start showing hands. How do you bring this to the Russian people, and when does this happen?
Well, I mean, the good news is
this is sort of a long-term...
It's a long-term thing, right? I mean, you and I were talking last night about maybe setting up a commission. I don't think this is something we could solve with a commission. It's got to come from here, from the Russians. And fortunately, the good news is there are Russians who are going down this path. I plug this book every time I'm on a stage because I think everybody should read it. Mikhail Zygar's book, War and Punishment, is probably the best thing I've read by a Russian about Ukraine. And I'm going to, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm going to quote from it, if I may, because Mikhail is really, he told me he wants to start a conversation And I said, if you're going to start this conversation, I hope you have really good security. He starts the book like this. This book is a confession. I am guilty for not reading the signs much earlier. I, too, am responsible for Russia's war against Ukraine, as are many of my contemporaries and our forebears. Regrettably, Russian culture is also to blame for making all these horrors possible. So that Russian culture may live on, we must act. We must start by looking inside ourselves and telling the truth about our past and our present. Russian, Ukrainian, and indeed all history is made up of myths. And alas, our myths have led us to the fascism of 2022, and it's time to expose them. We are still drugged up, intoxicated by the grandeur of imperialism. We've been smoking this drug for centuries, feeding our own vanity. The myth of greatness was spooned down our throats, injected into our veins, and made us high. So this is what we need to hear from more Russians, and we need to promote the Russians who are doing this because they're brave.
That's quite the quote, and it's a good recommendation for that book. Thank you. As I move into the shade so I can see hands coming up, I just see that we've got economic sanctions that we've discussed, visa bans, frozen assets, and some lawfare and some history. And maybe there's some other thoughts out there as well. We'll go first, and we have the second microphone can go to the gentleman in the baseball cap. So first, Emmanuel. And second mic to
Thanks.
the man.
Thank you for the brilliant presentations and seeing all the musketeers. We see each other for the last 30 years after dismantled the Soviet Union. And thank God we took part in that endeavors 34 years ago. My question will be, actually, in this town, we are remembering 100 years of uprisal, Tbilisi famous uprisal, when hundreds of thousands of Georgians took weapons against Bolshevik regime, and they liberated biggest part of Georgia. 5,000 after that was killed by Bolshevik army here in town. 5,000. It's more like in Czech Republic in 68, more like in Hungary. Let's commemorate the brave Georgian first uprisal when they almost become member of League of Nations in 1920s, yes? Now coming back. So about sanctions. So conferences created by Council of Europe just show how sanctions are implemented. I'm sorry to say, if we have the poster, all proletariat, if you remember Karl Marx in our cities, red poster, proletariats from all world, unite yourself. Someone can have poster, crooks from all the world, unite yourself. Well, you have thousands of companies, and I'm sorry, I'm leading the process in Council of Europe, and I would like to say that our prosecutor office and our intelligence found that more like 500 FSB, not Russian economy business units, but Russian FSB, people are working to avoid the sanctions together with all other crooks, and they becoming in the future agents of Russia. Well, all compromise material is in the hands of them. So the question is to you, how we encourage our law enforcement agencies to do what they're doing if you are Richard or Marco, if you are not paying 20 euros taxes, you will be followed by our financial. But if our companies are avoiding the sanctions for millions of dollars, they're not under scrutiny of our law enforcement agencies. How to encourage our intelligence community and how to create in our deep state enthusiastic move to follow our companies, Lithuanian companies, Latvian, Estonian, Polish, Italian, British, American, and probably from time to time even Ukrainian. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And you'll remember that question because we're going to take a couple, all right? Sure. So the gentleman in the baseball cap, could you say your name and introduce yourself? And then could we have this mic go to the gentleman right there?
Thank you. My name is Georgi Kandelaki. I just want to thank Brian for making this point of embracing history of this region through the Russian lens and how entrenched this embrace still is and has been. And perhaps Georgia is too a victim of that phenomenon. and particularly this idea that nationalities in the Soviet Union, including Georgians, and particularly Georgians, thrived because of the Soviet nationalities policies. And Soviet Union is still viewed in parts of Western academia as an anti-colonial sort of force. So the question would be, and by the way, and thank you, Emanuelis, for mentioning the centennial of the 1924 uprising, which was a which had a bloody aftermath against the Soviet Russian occupation, which was also a form of national oppression. So, Brian, to what extent that phenomenon is entrenched in Western bureaucracy? Because this bureaucracy is also educated in the environment which you just described. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And so, Brian, you'll remember that
Yes, I
question.
will.
And can we have that mic go to the gentleman behind the tree with the tie? But meanwhile, we're going to hear from this gentleman. Can you introduce yourself?
Hello, thank you. My name is Yuri. I'm from Ukraine, and I do represent the McCain Institute alumni community here. Thank you for the point on Mongolia, by the way. But my question is on India, the biggest bidder and buyer of Russian oil, and probably one of the biggest suppliers of cash to Russian state budget. Can secondary sanctions go that far to hold this? And also, Russian shadow fleet is still operational. Can anything still be done to it? Thank you.
Okay, that shadow freak, that one will be for you, Dan. So now we'll take that mic and bring it over to this gentleman here, Nick, and then you go ahead.
Hello, I'm Vlad Galushko from the Open Society Foundations. I want to build on the point that we heard Coles talked about the ICC. As you know, Ukraine just ratified the Rome Statute, one of the few countries, I think, who's done it during the war. And I feel it's like the only country that is interested in fulfilling the statute. And it's the only country that is tracking Putin and where it goes. Do you think there should be some red lines that the European Union needs to start to establishing more proactively for its partners that are not willing to follow the Rome Statute? Because it is in the EU interest to do so. Thanks.
Thank you. So you'll take that one, and Marco can take the first one. Yes.
How many?
Yes, I'm Nicolas Tenzer from Paris, France. Well, basically, I have two short questions. The first thing is, basically, Russia has committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, crime of genocide, and crime of aggressions against Ukraine. And before, as we know, in other countries, Syria, etc. So one of the key questions is, when you have a country committing those crimes without any statute of limitations, why do the world leaders not talking about those crimes day after day? Just not to trivialize these crimes. And I think there could be a huge effort, and the question is how to make the leaders speak each and every day about those crimes. The second point is, very shortly, is, let's be very clear. If there is not a full defeat of Russia, the punishment will never come.
Yes, sure.
Which means that we must have a clear strategy on defeating Russia, because we have to make Russia pay, not now, not in the 2 or 3 years to come, but in 20 and 30 years to come, because you have $2 trillion dollars basically of war damages to pay, without mentioning everything else. So we must have an additional tax to Russia. There must be part of a VAT that must be given to Ukraine. So there must be a long-term strategy, and it comes along certainly with the full consciousness of guilt among Russian people, because without this feeling of guilt, also nothing will happen. So we have to defeat Russia to achieve this goal. Thank you.
Okay, and let's take our last question here, and I hope everyone's remembered their questions.
Yeah. Tough task.
Just to continue what Nicolas has dropped off on, we Ukrainians do believe that it is about punishment of all the Russians. It is not about Russian elites. It's not about Putin. It's not about Shoigu. It's not about Lavrov. It is about them recognizing the guilt and being ready to pay for what they have done with their action or inaction to the Ukrainian people. That's one thing. But my question is, we've discussed here the sanctions, the circumvention of sanctions. How do we deal with all those countries that are trying to help to raise the trade with the Russian Federation? And we are so proud of ourselves in Europe that, well, we have cut off the Russian gas supplies through the pipelines. And then in the meantime, we've grown, well, last year it was 40%. I don't know what are the numbers of this year, the LNG imports from the Russian Federation to the countries of European Union. What do we do with this? It's just laying on the surface. How do we deal with those things where we are actually trying to say the lies to ourselves?
Okay, thank you. So Emmanuel's question was the first one.
Yeah, so I can take all the others.
Okay.
Well, Emmanuel has raised what we are doing at the national level. Well, there is already more than a dozen, I would say, several dozen criminal cases open against the Latvian entrepreneurs who are actually violating the sanctions. Our enforcement of sanctions, I think, is one of the most effective within the EU, because what we did several years ago, we mandated any company that is doing business in Latvia, they had to have a certain deadline to reveal their true beneficiaries. So we are very effective in applying the sanctions because we know already we can scrutinize in database and know who owns what and where, whereas in the rest of the Europe, the struggle is it is being done manually. Manually, the staff is going and looking through different databases and so on. So enforcement is slow and not effective. So that is something that can be taken from the Baltic countries as well. Well, I've been advocating, and I will continue to advocate even at the European level, at the EU level, is to close the borders for any physical movement across the border, be it the commodities, be it the trucks, whatever, be it for 2 weeks or month, and we will see the effect. And it will be crucial. And it's actually our part of the world, 5 countries that are bordering with Russia, and we can do that. It's a political will. It's not about, if it's feasible to be done. Questions on the ICC? Well, Europe is actually, EU is cooperating with Ukraine. It's called the Joint Investigation Team, where we're gathering all the evidence, actually all the 6.3 million refugees that are coming to European member states. We do, of course, cautiously through our intelligence services, we do interview, we gather the evidence, and we actually, when it's ready, then we pass it to ICC. So there is active work being conducted. I know Ukrainians already have filed and charged 600 cases. So I mentioned already there's 70,000 already documented cases. Of course, it takes time to identify, but there is already a mechanism in place. And well, trade with Russia, again, I mentioned the gas is, there were only 4 countries in Europe left that received the gas through the pipes. It was Hungary, Slovakia, Serbia, and Austria. I don't know what you're going to do in that facility that you have taken control of. If you're going to cut off the gas as well, not only oil. I would support Ukraine in doing that because we see when the nest of the cockroaches is being hit, they start to run around and panicking. I will not name them, but everyone understands. There are, small Putins within the Europe as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next question, Marco, did you have the next one?
Actually, the Richard's already touched upon that what we can do in order to enforce sanctions and really what we have agreed upon on the EU level or on national level. If you talk to the people who really are specialists and experts in that field, they say that you don't need to be a nuclear scientist how to avoid sanctions. Unfortunately, yep. We have seen the routes what are used, and actually, Richard, we can close those few borders what we have still open from EU side, but unfortunately, we cannot close China border with Russia. We cannot close, I don't know, even this part of the world is under consideration, how this is used, the routes from here to Russia. But anyway, what is most important is that we are not hitting hard actually the sectors which really matter in terms of making Russia accountable, or kind of their war efforts to hit. It's just incredible to know that we paying in Europe more money to Russia for fossil fuels still than we pay or for help, military help to Ukraine. How come? Where is the political kind of wisdom here? And that tells you that we don't take seriously about what is at stake. That what Nicolas said as well, that the only goal, what we should have in our minds today, is how to make sure that every effort we put into action, direct military help to Ukraine, and sanctions, and global diplomacy in that regard, should focus on that, how to make Russia defeated in this war. The Ukrainian flag above Sevastopol is something which make at least theoretical possibility that Russia will one day be accountable.
Dan, I wonder, there was that one point on the ghost ships, I think it was, and India, and the fact that basically economic sanctions are as watertight as a sieve. So any rounds up on that one?
Okay, small answer and then a larger answer. The small answer is there is more that can be done against the ghost fleet, but if you want to go after Russian oil income, we're going to have to change the sanctions structure, and there are things that can be done. There have been other oil sanctions regimes like Iran, which may have some lessons. Secondly is a larger question of whether imperfect sanctions work. And there will always be lots of articles written about the holes in sanctions, and those articles will be accurate. But, I'm so old that I remember the really lousy Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan era sanctions against the Soviet Union, and the US and Europe fought like hell over it. It was a real mess and a failure. Everyone agreed it was a failure. Well, look back. How did the Soviet economy do in the 1980s? Right. Looking back, the economic pressure against the Soviet Union in the 1980s made it more difficult for the Soviet economy to escape the consequences of, as Lenin would say, its contradictions. And you see where I'm going with this. The Russian economy is under pressure. Read the Anders Åslund, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld article about that pressure. No, it's not on the verge of collapse, but the strain is real and detectable. Keep it up. We don't know where the line of genuine pain is, but the Russians, like the Soviets, are good at the propaganda of success. You can feel the strains in the Russian economy. Keep it up, lean forward. And finally, I can't resist, as to Brian's point about Russia assuming responsibility. I don't like where Alexander Solzhenitsyn ended up, but in his wiser days, he once wrote that the line of good and evil runs through every nation and every human heart. I'm with Andreas Kubilius that Russia has democratic potential, but the road to that potential lies through Russia's defeat in Ukraine. And then we can see about whether Russia can account for its own miserable past. And I have to say that in the academic world, the rethinking of Russian history is taking place. In my world of American diplomacy, a lot of the champions of Ukraine have come from people who started out their careers as Russia specialists, who learned about Russia later through the prism of the people who Russia had visited. The Ukrainians, the Poles, the Balts. And that's been a hard road for us, and I think once learned will not be unlearned.
Yes, thank you. And I'll recommend this article by Anders Åslund as well. He basically points out the disinformation that's going on about the success of Russia skirting the economic sanctions. He ends by saying the resilience of the Russian economy is largely illusory, and I recommend it to everyone. Let's squeeze in Brian and Daria. So Brian, history?
You. Yeah, first of all, I want to give a shout out to Georgi, because the work you're doing at Sovlab is part of the solution here. Sovlab is publishing historical documents on Georgia's Soviet-era history that have been invaluable to me in my own work, and I think projects like this should be funded everywhere in the former Soviet space, in Belarus and elsewhere. To answer your question, there's good news and bad news. I mean, in universities where I am, the turnover is slow. There's only a few universities that are really teaching the history of these countries independent from the Russian colonial imperial version. Harvard University and Serhiy Plotky stand out, of course. Yale University and Timothy Snyder stand out, of course. Our Canadian neighbors to the north are much better than we Americans are at this, largely due to their large Ukrainian diaspora. But it's moving. I mean, I am trying to get Ukrainian studies instituted at the University of Texas Arlington in the European Studies Department, not in the Russian Studies Department. But this is a tough fight. There's a lot of entrenched interests. University bureaucracies make the American government look, fast and nimble, right? So it's a slow fight. In the national security bureaucracy, and I learned this from a conversation I had with you, Dan, about the generational turnover that's going on among foreign service officers since 1991. And in the beginning, of course, everybody served in Moscow and everybody saw things through Moscow's lens. Now we have generations that have served in Riga and in Tallinn and in Kyiv and in Tbilisi, and they are starting to see the world a little bit differently. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, because I would gladly yield to you on that.
I need to go to Daria first,
Right.
but thank you for that point, Brian. Daria.
I fully agree with Brian. We have to deoccupy history. But coming to Russians and good Russians and democratic future of Russia, I think that the West has to admit strategic failure for the last 35 years to believe that there can be democratic Russia and Russian liberals is the future of Russia. Unfortunately, people like Mikhail Zygar are absolute exemptions and absolute minority. And I believe that the only way when there will be accountability for Russia is when there will be in Kremlin the museum of all the genocidal war crimes which Russia and Russian people and Russian Soviet Union and before that Russian Empire committed against its neighbors, against Ukrainians, against Georgians, against Chechens, against Estonians, against Latvians, against Lithuanians, and we can count and count. I will believe that Russia has a future and Russian people has a future when Russian children will be studying in their historical textbooks about all these crimes. And I will feel relieved and I will feel that my mission in this life will be accomplished when there will be actually the tribunal against Russians in Mariupol. Mm-hmm. And all the Russian citizens, those who will be left, they will be hearing about this tribunal, like it was with the Nazi Germany after their complete defeat. But I absolutely believe that defeat is the #1 task. And I want the last to say thank you to all the Georgians, because we are here in Tbilisi, who are there in Ukraine now, in the armed forces, practically helping Russia to hold helping Ukraine to hold Russia accountable. This is the best way how to do that. And glory to Georgian heroes, which are with Ukrainian heroes, are doing that historic mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And join me in thanking a fairly powerful panel with excellent messages. Thank you.